I shot him in the back of the head.
As criminal offenders.
Prisons with the worst conditions in the world. 8 cases. Most of us complain about a bad hotel room or an uncomfortable airplane seat, and honestly, fair enough. But there are places on this planet where people are locked behind steel doors, become something truly awful. So today, we are going over 8 of the worst. Black Dolphin Prison. So there is this prison in Russia, out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, near the border with Kazakhstan, in a town called Soliletsk. It is called Black Dolphin, and the name actually comes from a sculpture of a black dolphin that sits right outside the front entrance. Inmates built it, but the history of this place goes way further back than that sculpture. Black Dolphin has been used to hold people since at least 1745, when it functioned as a hard labor camp. After the Pugachev rebellion was crushed in the 1770s, Russian authorities expanded it to hold robbers and other offenders who needed to be shipped far away from civilization. Fast forward to the year 2000, and the prison was converted into a full supermax facility for inmates serving mandatory life sentences. Russia abolished the death penalty in 1996, so for the people sent here, life behind these walls is quite literally the rest of their lives. There is no parole. As of recent years, it holds around 700 of Russia's most violent offenders. We are talking serial killers, terrorists, cannibals, and people convicted of crimes against children. The combined body count of the inmates here is reportedly close to 4,000 victims. There are roughly 900 guards for those 700 inmates, so the ratio of staff to prisoners is more than 1 to 1. So, what does daily life actually look like inside Black Dolphin? Every single cell sits behind 3 sets of steel doors. 2 inmates share a space that measures roughly 50 square feet, which is about the size of a walk-in closet. The crimes of each inmate are written on their cell doors, so that guards never feel an ounce of sympathy. They wake up at 6 in the morning, and from that moment until lights out at 10, they are required to stay on their feet. Sitting or lying on the bunk during the day is against the rules. Even at night, a bright light stays on inside the cell, and inmates are forbidden from covering their heads with blankets. Guards come by every 15 minutes to check on every cell, and cameras are rolling around the clock. For food, inmates are given soup and bread 4 times a day. All meals are eaten inside their cells because there is no cafeteria, no communal dining. The only items allowed in the cell are books, newspapers, and a radio, which becomes their only connection to the outside world. Exercise time is 90 minutes a day, but it is spent inside a slightly larger concrete cage with no equipment. And while inmates are out there pacing back and forth, guards tear through their cells looking for anything that should not be there. Even spoons are considered potentially dangerous. One of the most striking things about Black Dolphin is how inmates are transported. Whenever they are moved between buildings, they are blindfolded and forced to walk bent over at the waist with their handcuffed arms raised up behind their backs. The whole point is to keep them disoriented so they can never map out the layout of the facility. Some guards also work alongside attack dogs, and the constant barking is another psychological tool. And there is a verbal rule that adds another layer of control. Whenever a guard issues any kind of command, the inmate has to immediately respond with the words, "Yes, sir." There is no room for hesitation or pushback. One notable person who was held at Black Dolphin was Carola Neher, a German actress. She was sentenced to 10 years for alleged Trotskyism during the Soviet era and was moved between several prisons before ending up here. She died of typhus at Black Dolphin in 1942 at the age of 41. The prison has never had a successful escape. Its remote location on the steppe, its layered walls, motion sensors, armed watchtowers, and the constant disorientation of inmates make it practically impossible for anyone to even attempt it. Human rights organizations have compared conditions here to the old Soviet Gulag system, and after Russia was expelled from the Council of Europe in 2022, the last threads of international oversight were cut entirely. Kamiti Maximum Security Prison.
Ed Kyondo is one such man. He has spent 24 years of his...
If you are looking for a prison that was doomed from the start by design alone, Kamiti is a good place to begin. This facility sits on the outskirts of Nairobi, Kenya, on a sprawling 1,200-acre estate that was originally called Kamiti Downs. The British colonial administration established it in the 1950s during the state of emergency to hold political prisoners, including fighters in the Mau Mau uprising. During the 1980s and 1990s, It continued to hold political detainees under President Daniel Arap Moi's regime. One of the most significant executions carried out here was that of Mau Mau rebel leader Dedan Kimathi, who was hanged by the British on the 18th of February 1957. 2 more executions followed in 1987, and Kenya has not carried out a single execution since, although the death penalty has never been formally abolished. But the real problem at Kamiti today comes down to numbers. The prison was designed to hold about 1,400 inmates. At various points, it has held well over 3,600. That is more than double its intended capacity, and the consequences of that overcrowding touch every part of life inside. There is no reliable water supply. Over 200 inmates have been documented hauling buckets of water across the facility every day just to meet basic needs. Sanitation has essentially collapsed. In wards housing 32 inmates, the washroom space measures barely 35 square feet. Disease spreads quickly under these conditions, and cholera outbreaks have occurred within the facility. Inmates in the industrial section of the prison are paid just 10 cents in Kenyan shillings per day, based on legislation from the 1940s that has never been updated. Within the prison, there is a section called G Block, which is designated for inmates convicted of sexual offenses and those sentenced to death. G Block has developed a reputation as one of the most brutal areas in the entire facility, with accounts of extreme violence among inmates and rampant contraband. And speaking of contraband, Kamiti became internationally notorious for something you would never expect from a maximum security prison. Inmates had been running what was essentially an illegal phone scam operation from inside the walls. Using smuggled mobile phones with voice-altering features, prisoners posed as foreign business people, military recruitment officers, and even representatives of local radio stations to swindle money from civilians outside. Guards allegedly participated in the operation, with some reportedly earning thousands of shillings a day from the scheme. A Citizen TV investigation exposed the full scope of it, and the Kenya Prison Service was forced to respond publicly. Then, in November 2021, something happened that shook the country. 3 inmates convicted of terrorism offenses managed to escape from the most secure block in Kamiti. One of them had been serving 41 years for his role in the 2015 Garissa University attack that killed 148 people. The escapees dug through a wall during routine maintenance, scaled a 10-foot perimeter wall using a rope, and vanished. Guards did not realize they were gone until the next morning. 7 prison warders were arrested, and investigations revealed the escape had been carefully planned with help from inside. All 3 were recaptured days later near the Kitui-Tana River border, heading toward the Somali border. In 2026, 3 of the warders involved were convicted for aiding the escape and sentenced to prison themselves. A $60 million bounty had been placed on the fugitives, roughly $530,000 at the time, and the entire incident led to the firing of Commissioner General Wycliffe Ogala. Brigadier John Warioba was sworn in as his replacement. For a place that is supposed to be the most secure in the country, it was a devastating and very public failure. During the colonial era and beyond, Kamiti has also been the site of many political detentions. Figures like Raila Odinga, Kenneth Matiba, and even Nobel Prize-nominated author Ngugi wa Thiong'o were held here. The prison holds a complicated place in Kenyan history, tied up in both colonial repression and modern systemic neglect. USP Terre Haute. This next one is in the American Midwest, and it carries a very specific kind of weight. The United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, sits on about 1,100 acres of land along the Wabash River, roughly 70 miles west of Indianapolis. President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized its construction in 1938 with a $3 million grant from the Public Works Administration, and it opened in 1940. What made Terre Haute unique from the very beginning was its approach to inmates. It was one of the first federal prisons in the country to focus on psychological and psychiatric treatment. Staff referred to inmates by their names instead of numbers. Prisoners were allowed to talk to each other during meals, which was unheard of at the time. The institution even pioneered the use of the word inmate as a replacement for less dignified labels like convict or criminal. The architectural design followed a modified telephone pole layout, and it was actually the first federal penitentiary for adult felons ever built without a wall. But the facility took on a very different role starting in the 1990s. In 1993, the federal government designated Terre Haute as the site for the federal death row. Then, in July 1999, the Special Confinement Unit opened, a 120-cell third-floor unit specifically built to house men sentenced to death by the federal government. The location was chosen because of its central position within the United States. The most well-known execution carried out here was that of Timothy McVeigh on the 11th of June 2001. McVeigh was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which killed 168 people, including 19 children. He was the first federal prisoner to be executed since 1963, ending a 38-year moratorium. 8 days later, drug kingpin Juan Raul Garza was executed in the same chamber, and in 2003, Louis Jones Jr. became the third. Then, between July 2020 and January 2021, the federal government executed 13 more people at Terre Haute in rapid succession, the most in any concentrated period in modern American history. Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was sentenced to death for his role in the 2013 attack that killed 3 and injured hundreds. He was originally designated for death row at Terre Haute, but as of 2024, he was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado due to security concerns. His death sentence was vacated by an appeals court in 2020, but reinstated by the Supreme Court in 2022. In 2008, the ACLU raised serious concerns about conditions in the Special Confinement Unit, alleging inadequate medical and mental health care, along with sleep deprivation caused by constant noise from the facility's industrial systems. Inmates in the unit spend roughly 23 hours a day in their cells. Exercise is limited, communication is tightly restricted, and there is a rule that all conversations must be conducted in English. The prison also operates Unicor, a federal prison industry program where inmates manufacture towels and other goods for the military. In 2021, COVID-19 tore through the facility, adding another grim chapter to its history. The prison complex also includes a medium-security federal correctional institution, created in 2004 when the original penitentiary building was converted after a new high-security facility opened on adjoining property. There is also a minimum security prison camp on the grounds. Notably, Camp 5 at the Guantanamo Bay Detention Facility was reportedly based on the design of USP Terre Haute. Today, as of late 2025, 3 men remain on federal death row, with 2 of them housed at Terre Haute. And in April 2026, the Department of Justice directed the Bureau of Prisons to expand its execution methods beyond lethal injection to include firing squad, electrocution, and lethal gas. The facility that was once built to rehabilitate is now at the center of an expanding apparatus of capital punishment. San Quentin.
Here for killing another gang member. I shot him in the back of the head.
California's oldest prison has a story that starts on the water. In the late 1840s, the gold rush brought hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers flooding into San Francisco, and crime followed right behind them. The population of San Francisco surged from about 1,000 to 25,000 in a single year. The city's 6 county jails could not handle the surge, so officials bought a retired merchant ship called the Wabun and turned it into a floating prison. Inmates were forced to sleep on the ship at night and spend their days on land at Point San Quentin in Marin County, quarrying stone and building the very prison that would hold them. The state paid $10,000 for 20 acres of land at the site, choosing it for its deep water port, proximity to a quarry, and bedrock foundation. The first cell block was completed in 1854 with 48 windowless cells designed for 250 inmates, though that number was exceeded almost immediately. But the early years were a disaster. The state handed the facility over to private investors to run, and those investors were allowed to hire out the inmates for labor in exchange for running the facility. What followed was widespread abuse. The first lessor, General James Estelle, even sold pardons to inmates for profit. Prisoners were subjected to floggings and high-pressure water hose punishments as standard discipline. 100 to 150 lashes were administered for escape attempts, and lesser infractions brought a proportional beating. Security was so weak that in 1854 alone, more than 80 inmates escaped. Marin County residents complained about a band of former inmates living on nearby Mount Tamalpais and stealing from surrounding communities. Complaints piled up, and by 1860, the state finally took full control. San Quentin went on to become California's primary execution facility. Over 400 people have been executed here since 1893. A gas chamber was installed in 1938 and used until 1993. Lethal injection replaced it and was last used in 2006. In 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom issued a moratorium on the death penalty. For decades, San Quentin held the largest death row in the entire United States and the largest in the Western Hemisphere. At its peak, more than 700 men were housed across 3 death row sections. North segregation, built in 1934, was for inmates who stayed out of trouble. East Block, built in 1927, held most of the death row population in deteriorating, leaky conditions. And the adjustment center was reserved for the most volatile inmates, with solid doors installed to prevent attacks using bodily waste. One of the most well-known inmates to serve time at San Quentin was Sirhan, who was convicted of the 1968 assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Charles Manson also spent years here. The Aryan Brotherhood, one of the oldest and most violent prison gangs in the country, was founded within these walls in 1964. Violence has been a recurring reality throughout the prison's history. A failed escape attempt in 1971 left 6 people dead. And, in 2020, a severe COVID-19 outbreak swept through the facility, infecting more than 2,000 inmates and killing 28, drawing national attention to the dangers of overcrowding during a pandemic. In 2023, Governor Newsom announced a plan to transform San Quentin into a rehabilitation center. Death row inmates began being transferred to other state facilities in compliance with Proposition 66, and by early 2025, only 9 condemned inmates remained. The prison itself still operates on its 275 acres of land overlooking San Francisco Bay, valued in a 2001 study at somewhere between $129 million and $664 million. A place that started as an experiment in privatized incarceration during one of the most chaotic periods in California history is now being reshaped entirely. Women were once held here too, from 1856 until 1933, in a building where guards reportedly shared their quarters and operated a bar on the grounds. The first prison school was established in 1868 with 250 students. So San Quentin has always been a facility in tension with itself, caught between punishment and progress. Whether the current transformation delivers on its promises is still an open question. Mendoza Prison. In the western Argentine province of Mendoza, there is a prison that has drawn international condemnation for conditions that are hard to overstate. The main facility, known locally as La Penitenciaria, was holding 3 times the number of inmates it was designed for. Up to 5 people were crammed into cells that measured roughly 40 square feet, and they slept on the bare floor because there were no mattresses. Inmates defecated in plastic bags and urinated in bottles because the plumbing had long since ceased to function. Corridors were littered with days of accumulated garbage and regularly flooded with raw sewage. In 2004, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights sent a delegation to inspect the prison. Commissioner Florentin Melendez described conditions he said were unfit for animals. He reported that it was impossible to even identify where the bathrooms were because the entire sewage system had completely collapsed. The IACHR ordered the Mendoza provincial government to adopt immediate provisional measures to protect the lives and personal integrity of the inmates. A year later, in 2005, Amnesty International released a detailed report that confirmed every bit of what the IACHR had found, and then added more. The report revealed that medical staff never entered the prison wings. There were no nurses, no dentists, no psychiatrists, and no psychologists to attend to either the prisoners or the guards. Medicines were scarce. Inmates who needed medical attention would sometimes cut themselves deliberately just to be seen by someone. Amnesty noted that medical staff were typically called in only after someone had already died. Guards used hoods when conducting cell searches, which Amnesty described as a method to carry out physical abuse without being identified. Human rights lawyers in Mendoza reported that many of the young officers involved in these searches had previously served under the 1976 to 1983 military dictatorship and were now carrying those practices into the modern prison system, holding high-level positions. Families of inmates were also targeted. One father described how guards spat in his son's food, stole his clothing, and threw the food his family brought into the courtyard. When he protested, he was warned that he might get his son back in a box. The most striking act of protest came in 2005. Argentina's own constitution requires that prisons be safe, clean, and healthy, with a mandate to prioritize rehabilitation. But the reality inside Mendoza was the complete opposite. A significant portion of the people held there were pre-trial detainees, meaning they had not been convicted of anything. They were enduring the same brutal conditions as sentenced offenders while waiting years for their cases to move through the court system. The broader picture across Argentina is troubling. Amnesty reported that only 2 out of 40 violent inmate deaths in the province of Buenos Aires since 2000 had been properly investigated. By 2022, the overcrowding rate in Buenos Aires province prisons had exploded from 7% to 100% in just a decade, and Argentina reached its highest incarceration rate in the country's history. Much of the overcrowding is driven by the excessive use of pretrial detention, with people held for years in police facilities that were never designed for long-term stays. A 2025 review by the UN Committee Against Torture noted that violence and overcrowding continue to plague the country's prison system, with 104 incidents of protests and use of force reported in penitentiary facilities across multiple provinces. The Argentine constitution promises rehabilitation, but for the people trapped inside Mendoza's walls, that promise has been nothing more than words on paper, while the reality around them continues to deteriorate. Holman Correctional Facility.
Look, man, they were going on there.
Violent attacks and rioting by the inmates at Holman Prison.
The Department of Justice is investigating Alabama's prison system.
The inmates gave this place its name before anyone else could. They called it the Slaughterhouse. Others called it the Slaughter Pen of the South, the House of Pain, Dead Man Land, or just the Bottom, a reference to its location in the deep southern end of Alabama where, as one inmate put it, "You cannot get any lower than this." The William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, opened in December 1969. It was built on a budget of $5 million during the administration of Governor Lurleen Wallace. Originally designed for 581 inmates, it was soon holding well over 1,000. The design included 632 general population beds, 200 single cells, and a death row unit. Alabama's execution chamber is located here, and all of the state's executions are carried out at this facility. The violent reputation started early. In 1974, a staff member was killed by an inmate with a knife. Then, in 1985, a major riot erupted, and 22 people, including wardens and other employees, were taken hostage. By the 1970s, overcrowding was already so severe that federal judges ordered Alabama to stop sending inmates to Holman. Things calmed down briefly after Warden Grant Culliver took over in 2002, but by 2016, Holman had reclaimed its title as one of the most dangerous prisons in the country. The Department of Justice launched an investigation that year into conditions for both prisoners and officers. Authorized staffing levels at the time were less than a fifth of what they should have been, and annual staff turnover was roughly 60%. On the 12th of March 2016, roughly 100 inmates rioted. They set fires in dormitories and stabbed the warden, Carter Davenport, in the neck and a correctional officer multiple times. The violence lasted through the night before emergency response teams regained control. 5 inmates were identified as ringleaders and transferred out. Then, in September 2016, Correctional Officer Kenneth Bettis, 44 years old and from Monroeville, was stabbed while working in the prison dining hall after denying an inmate an extra food tray. He died from his injuries at the University of South Alabama Hospital days later. His death sent shockwaves through the facility. Later that same month, a group of corrections officers refused to report for their shifts, citing unsafe conditions and overcrowding. This was part of a larger movement. The 2016 nationwide prison strike, which eventually spread across more than 10 states and involved roughly 20,000 inmates, originated right here at Holman. The strike demanded increased wages for prison labor and improved conditions. Staff corruption has been a persistent problem, with investigations uncovering canteen workers smuggling drugs into the facility and former wardens facing misconduct convictions. In December 2018, 1 inmate was killed, and 3 others were injured in coordinated fights involving homemade weapons, leading to another full lockdown. A pastor who worked with inmates told reporters that stabbings were a daily occurrence and that every person who arrived was told to arm themselves. In March 2019, 8 inmates transferred from Street 2006 Clare Correctional Facility and placed directly into solitary confinement at Holman launched a hunger strike, each stating they were being held in segregation without justifiable reason. By late January 2020, the state announced that most of Holman would be closed due to severe deterioration of underground utilities. The death row unit and the execution chamber, however, remain in operation to this day. Alabama has continued to carry out executions at Holman, including the first nitrogen hypoxia execution in U.S. history. In January 2024, the facility also lacks air conditioning, which is a serious problem in southern Alabama, where summer temperatures regularly hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Inmates have described the conditions as being left to boil alive, and some have been photographed holding up signs at their cell windows with the word "help" written on them. Holman has always been a place defined by what it lacks: enough beds, enough guards, enough basic infrastructure, and in that absence, violence fills the gap. Inmates have brewed homemade alcohol using water, sugar, and yeast, a concoction they called julep, which a documentary producer described as looking like raw sewage. In a place with no outlets, people find any escape they can. ADX Florence
are the baddest of the bad. Here, every inmate's movement.
Somewhere in the Colorado high desert, about 2 hours south of Denver, there is a federal prison that was designed to be the last stop for the most dangerous inmates in the country. ADX Florence, formerly known as the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, opened in 1994. It was built in direct response to 2 correctional officers, Merle Klutz and Robert Hoffman, being fatally stabbed at the Marion Federal Prison in Illinois in October 1983. That event convinced the Bureau of Prisons that a new kind of facility was needed. The result was a $60 million complex built into the landscape of the Rocky Mountain foothills and surrounded by 12 gun towers, razor wire, guard dogs, and laser beam perimeter sensors. People started calling it the Alcatraz of the Rockies, and the comparison is fitting because in its entire history, there has never been a single successful escape. Every inmate at ADX Florence lives in a 7 by 12-foot cell made almost entirely of poured concrete. The bed, desk, stool, and shelf are all concrete. There is a stainless steel sink-toilet combination and a shower that runs on a timer. A narrow slit window is angled so that inmates can see a small patch of sky but nothing else. The cells are soundproofed, and floors are fitted with pressure sensors to track movement. Inmates spend 23 hours a day alone in that cell. The 1 hour outside of it is spent in a concrete exercise pit, an enclosed space with high walls and no equipment, just enough room to walk back and forth alone. There is almost no human contact. The minimum stay in solitary at ADX is 3 years. The security infrastructure here is layered beyond anything else in the federal system. There are over 1,400 remote-controlled steel doors, pressure-sensitive flooring, motion detectors, and surveillance cameras covering every inch of the facility. A centralized control room monitors everything and has a panic button system. Robert Hood, who served as warden from 2002 to 2005, described it as a tomb and said people are sent there to die. ADX has 6 different security levels. Inmates can theoretically work their way from the most restrictive housing down to less restrictive units and eventually earn a transfer to another facility. But that process takes years of incident-free behavior, and for many, it never happens. Among the inmates who have been held at ADX are Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, who is housed in Range 13, a special 4-cell wing for the most tightly controlled prisoners. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was held here for over 2 decades before being transferred to a federal medical facility, where he died in June 2023. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, was transferred here from Terre Haute in 2024. Mexican drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who escaped from 2 maximum security prisons in Mexico, has been held here since 2019, also in Range 13. In 2012, inmates filed a class action lawsuit alleging that the extreme isolation and sensory deprivation at ADX was causing severe psychological harm. Reports documented inmates who had developed psychotic symptoms. A psychiatrist named Stuart Gracian had previously identified a condition called SHU syndrome, characterized by paranoia, panic attacks, aggression, and hallucinations. a 60 Minutes producer who toured the facility. Despite decades of criticism from human rights organizations and mental health professionals, courts have consistently ruled that the conditions at ADX Florence do not violate constitutional protections against inhumane punishment. As of April 2026, the facility holds 408 inmates, and its role as the most secure prison in the federal system remains firmly in place. Rikers Island.
Come with us to Rikers Island, the biggest jail complex in America. A place haunted by its violent history. 8,000 inmates living in a kind of suspension.
And then there is Rikers, a place that sits in the middle of New York City's East River and somehow manages to feel like it exists in an entirely different world. Rikers Island covers about 413 acres and is home to one of the largest jail complexes on the planet. The complex is operated by the New York City Department of Correction, with a staff of over 9,000 officers, and has processed roughly 100,000 admissions per year. It is also one of the largest mental health facilities in the United States, with roughly 57% of the people held there having a mental health diagnosis, and about 21% having a serious mental illness. But here is the thing that a lot of people do not realize. Rikers is a jail, not a prison. That means the vast majority of the people held there, they are pre-trial detainees, waiting for their cases to move through the court system, often because they cannot afford bail. It was heavily criticized in the 1970s and 1980s for overpopulation and violence against incarcerated adolescents. In 2014, a Justice Department investigation found a deep-seated culture of violence that was pervasive, with staff using force as a means of control rather than a last resort. Officers have reported being assaulted regularly, with incidents of inmates throwing bodily waste at staff becoming a routine hazard. In the 2010s, a series of reforms were attempted. Strip searches were restricted in certain situations, and daily weapons searches by specialized teams became standard. Some of those efforts produced measurable results. The number of stabbings and slashings dropped significantly compared to prior peaks. The facility's chief medical officer described conditions as a new and worsening emergency, fueled by the aftermath of COVID-19 and a surge in the jail population. 15 incarcerated people died at Rikers that year alone. Since 2020, more than 60 incarcerated individuals have died in New York City jails, the majority of them at Rikers. Oversight officials deemed most of these deaths preventable. In 2025, another 15 people died. Staffing has been a chronic issue. The jail system has operated with roughly one staff member for every incarcerated person, a ratio wildly out of line with the national average of about 3.6 detainees per staff member. Guards have walked off the job in protest over conditions, and absenteeism among correction officers has reached alarming levels. The cost of all this is staggering. A 2021 analysis by the New York City Comptroller found that it cost the city about $556,539 to detain one person at Rikers for a single year. In October 2019, the New York City Council voted to close Rikers entirely by August 2027 and replace it with 4 smaller, borough-based jails. The original cost estimate was $8.7 billion, but that figure has since ballooned to at least $15 billion. Construction has been delayed repeatedly, and as of early 2026, the closure plan is behind schedule. In January 2026, a federal judge appointed an independent remediation manager named Nicholas Demel to take direct control of the jails after years of failed reform efforts. The island that was once expanded through convict labor hauling ashes for landfill has become a symbol of something much bigger than a jail. 90% of the people held at Rikers are Black or Latino. Black people are jailed in New York City at 11.6 times the rate of white people. So the crisis at Rikers is also a crisis of racial inequality in the justice system. Among the women held there, 83% have reported mental health issues. People who need mental health care are held an average of 281 days, compared to 212 days for those without such needs. The jail is supposed to be a short-term holding facility, but for many, it becomes a prolonged ordeal with no treatment and no end in sight. For a facility that sits just minutes from some of the most expensive real estate in the world, Rikers reflects what happens when a system built to hold people accountable stops being accountable itself.